Hello, Pedal. How you doing? How was your weekend? How are things? How's it going? Thank you so much for joining me for the live, if you were able to. And thank you to everybody that's listened to it since. Much appreciated. It was great fun and it was a really good time. And I hope to do some more in the future. We'll just let things just ease in and settle in and see how it's all going. Yes. As ever, if you enjoy this chapter, please hit the like button, the little thumbs up, give it a little thumbs up, because it does help to keep the lights on and keeps little hamsters happy and fluffy and in conditioner for their lovely soft fur. It doesn't just happen by magic. So it looks like we're going to finish the Faust equals this week, and then we'll go on to Paint Your Dragon. And of course, I'll be doing Challenge Chocolate Factory for autumn, because that's fast approaching, and there's lots of other projects on the horizon as well. So we're very, very, very excited about that indeed. So let me know how you're doing in the comments. Tell me how things are. Tell me jokes. Tell me anything. I don't mind. So then, we are going to be on chapter 19 to Faust Among Equals. We're really cracking on because I think there's only a couple of chapters on after this one, or might be 3, but they're quite short chapters. So there's an awful lot to pack into just a few little chapters, but we'll see how we get on. Oakley dokley dooley doo. Enough with the malargles. Let's crack on with Faust Among Equals by the glorious Mr. Thomas of Holt, chapter the 19th. There is much esoteric argument in contract-killing circles about the greatest asset a hitman can have. Some say the new Steer sniper's rifle with infrared dot sights and integral sound suppressor. Others argue for a mint-condition, first-issue Sykes-Fairbairn combat knife, while a significant minority gives its vote to the .50 caliber Desert Eagle with Hydra Shock plus P ammo and a Kastner scope. Kurt Lundqvist, however, begs to differ. As far as he's concerned, the assassin most likely to succeed is the one who has rather more brains and can comfortably be fitted into a matchbox. All the matches haven't been removed. This, he realises, rules out about 97% of his professional colleagues. So what? The last person to call him a reactionary elitist is now an integral part of the foundation of New York's celebrated Flatiron Building. His sequence of thought, once he'd realised that Lucky George had slipped past him at the Heltzer Pop Inn, was as follows. Lucky George has escaped. When it comes to getting away with it, Lucky George is about the best there is. It is therefore pointless to try and stop Lucky George getting to the emergency exit. Far better to go directly to the emergency exit and wait for him there. Slowly, and with infinite labour, Lynx Jotapian drove the last crampon into the side of the pit and paused, dragging air into his creased lungs before hauling himself over the lip of the pit and onto solid ground. Some escape, huh? First, he'd broken his fall by throwing his arms and legs out to their full extent until the friction of his hands and feet against the toughened glass sides of the shaft had slowed him down and eventually stopped him. Fair enough, but he couldn't stay a wedge like that forever, and as soon as he moved hand or foot down, he'd continue going. Fortunately, however, he'd got with him his Kurt Lundqvist limited edition adventurers kit. As a matter of cold fact, the production of this piece of merchandising hadn't been sanctioned by the man himself, which may account for the fact that the merchandiser now lives at the bottom of the Hudson River and wears concrete trainers. Nevertheless, the contents of the package, which collapses down to the size of a ballpoint pen and is made, of course, in Korea, include such useful items as suction pads for hands and feet, crampons, a folding ice axe, 200 yards of gossamer-thin polymer cord, breaking point 6 tons, and a small rectangular key thing with no discernible purpose whatsoever. One-handed opening of kit, extraction of suction pad, donning of same, and adhesion to the wall. It was then just a case of biffing in crampons and a long hard slog uphill. Still, better than school. Mr. Lundqvist? The walkie-talkie was dead. squatted into a jumble of springs and wires by a collision with the shaft wall. He dumped it. A month's waiting on tables at by Speckian's diner down the tubes, but one learns to be stoical under combat conditions, and applied his mind. Think like Lundqvist, and you'll know where he is. Lynx cast an eye over the grounds of the park and concentrated. Lucky George is a pro, right? Where would a pro hide? Think lesson 6. Answer, a pro will always try and find a crowd to mingle with because the best camouflage is people. In fact, that's really the only reason Lynx could possibly imagine for their existing at all. Various crowds dotted about the place. The queue for the Pharisees. No, too static. A pro tries not to remain stationary for more than 5 seconds in a combat zone. Therefore, rule out also the milling throng waiting to go into the torture by outsized musical instruments, and the night eaten by dogs booth. There was quite a knot of people hanging about at the top of the campus, opposite the Pharisees, but that was also too conspicuous. The toad rides, up to the top of the sand dunes and back astride a giant red-spotted toad conducted by a bare-headed fiend, 50 cents, children and perjurors, half price, were closely supervised by fiends, and a pro doesn't go anywhere where there's too many guards looking at faces. There were a few passers-by waiting for Captain Beaky's next feed, but in the circumstances, George probably wouldn't feel too comfortable hanging about around there. That left the paintball game. Idiots rush in where demons fear to tread. Slowly and deliberately, Lynx checked his equipment. Nightstick, Smith & Wesson, model 686 in .357, loaded with federal 160-grain jacketed hollow points, handcuffs, ninja throwing stars. Something else, but he couldn't remember what. Ah, yes, that was it, and he had indeed remembered to put on clean underwear that morning. He pulled his balaclava down over his face and broke into a loping run. Honest to God, his intention had been simply to find Lundqvist and help out. The thought of making the collar himself, alone and unassisted, wiping his Mentos eye and incidentally claiming the staggeringly huge reward hadn't once crossed his mind, but there he was, large as life, strolling hands in pockets towards the emergency exit, eating candy floss and with a seagull sitting on his shoulder. Lucky George, history's most wanted man, hot damn! With a cool smoothness born of countless hours of practice in front of the bathroom mirror, Lynx crouched, drew, and assumed a perfect weaver stance. Feeling for the bottom of the trigger, McGivern style, he drew a fine bead on the side of George's head, took up the slack on the trigger and yelled, "Freeze!" George stopped, looked round at him and said, "Me?" "You!" Lynx half closed his left eye, concentrating with all his being on the little strips of light either side of the foresight. "One moving, your history, man." George raised an eyebrow. "How do you mean?" he said. The gyroscope inside Lynx's brain wobbled slightly. "What?" he shouted. "How do you mean history? Don't I become suddenly famous or something?" "It means you get to be strictly past tense, man. Like the late Lucky George kind of thing. You get..." "Late for what?" "Your own funeral, sucker." The foresight of the Smith wavered about. No matter how you try, you just can't combine repartee with marksmanship. Ask Oscar Wilde, or anyone. "Oh, I think they'd wait, don't you?" George replied. "I mean, not much point having the wretched thing if there's nothing to bury. Mind you, if, for example, mine was at 10:30 and they'd got another one booked in at 11:15, say, I can see there could be problems. Hers is double parked, that sort of thing. Right, I'll bear that in mind. Look!" On the other hand, George continued through a mouthful of finely spun sugar. "The same would go for weddings, wouldn't it? And think how many times the bride shows up late. Never causes a problem in the long run, though, does it? I think they make allowances for that sort of thing in their scheduling. Look! George nodded upwards. There's a seagull hovering over your head with a 10-pound lead weight in its claws. Had you noticed? Lynx sneered. You think I was born yesterday? He said contemptuously. George considered. Well, he said, if you were, you're pretty damn precocious. That's all I can say. I take it you're not fussed about the seagull. Look! The lead way it fell, hitting Lynx on the back of the head. Thanks, Larry, George called out. Right, can you please get on? This place is starting to get on my nerves. The emergency exit was just behind the helmeted dwarf, cunningly concealed in the gaping jaws of a 12-foot-long polystyrene dragon. Just around the point home, there was also a big no-entry sign just above the dragon's head, qualified by the words, except for access. After a final look round, George reached for the door handle, but the door swung out of its own accord to reveal Lundqvist standing behind his trusty .40 Glock. Before George had time to move at all, Lundqvist was through the door and the pistol's ugly snout was nuzzling his ear. "Okay, George," Lundqvist hissed. "Lose the gulls. Now." George shrugged. "You heard the man, guys. Go for a ride on the Lucky Dipper or something. I shan't be long." Mike flapped his wings and opened his beak to protest, but his bird's eye, hundreds of times more perceptive than his human equivalent, saw Lundqvist's finger move maybe a thousandth of an inch on the trigger, and he subsided. "Be seeing you then," he gulped and bobbed away into the breeze. Larry remained where he was. "You too, beakface," Lundqvist growled. "You'll pay for this," the gull replied. "One day." Lundqvist grinned. "You reckon?" Larry nodded. "Maybe not tomorrow," he said. "Maybe not this year. But sometime, somewhere, you'll be hanging out washing or cleaning the car and then splat. You just think about that, Lundqvist. That's all." With long, heavy wing beats, he dragged himself into the air and soon was nothing but a white speck. Lundqvist let his breath go. "You and me, George," he said. "You and me, Kurt. How about a nice game of backgammon?" Lundqvist shook his head. "Not this time, George," he said. "This time it's goodbye. Forever. Dead or alive, they said. Remember?" "I take it you're going for the lazy option." Lundqvist nodded. "It's my back," he said. "Too much heavy lifting and I get shooting pains up my left side." George raised a quizzical eyebrow. "Don't think dead's got a lot of significance here, Kurt," he said. "If you don't mind my saying so. Sort of goes with the territory, if you see what I—" "No!" Lundqvist's grin widened. "This thing's loaded with hollow points filled with holy water." "I see," said George. "A water pistol." "Holy water," Lundqvist repeated. "Dead and exercised in one shot. We call it one-stop termination. You ain't going nowhere." How terribly clever. George's face had on its patient, let's humour the child expression, the very same one that had haunted Lundqvist's childhood nightmares. It meant, "Kurt, I'm going to make you look an absolute plonker in front of the whole school," and it had never once failed to deliver. Lundqvist quickly reviewed the situation in his mind and decided that for the first and last time, George was simply bluffing. "So," George said, "you reckon you can just cold-bloodedly pull the trigger and blow my brains out? Is that it?" "Yup." The expression blossomed into a smile of tender contempt. "Not unless you take the safety catch off first, you can't," he said. In the split second it took Lundqvist to check, to see that the safety catch was indeed off, and start squeezing off the shot, George had taken the remainder of his candy floss, stuck it up the barrel of the gun, and kicked Lundqvist savagely in the nuts. With a howl that was 5% pain and 95% frustrated rage, Lundqvist slowly doubled up and sagged onto the ground. "Never mind, Kurt," said George, not unkindly, as he stepped over his fallen assailant. "One of these days you'll get something right. Just you wait and see." Then he stepped through the door and closed it behind him. Thanks to his abstemious lifestyle and peak physical condition, it took Lundqvist maybe a total of 3 minutes to recover sufficiently to haul himself up onto his feet, totter wildly and fall flat on his face, banging his forehead painfully on a sharp stone. Which only goes to show, had he ruined his health with alcohol, rich foods and dissipation, he'd never have been fit enough to get beaten up in the first place. Once he'd managed to get his legs working again, he pulled the candy floss stick out of the muzzle of his gun, kicked open the emergency exit door and burst through. Circumstances alter cases. None of that hyper-cautious cat-like stealth one associates with the covert operations pro, flattening oneself against walls, darting in and out of shadows, and leaping around corners in a copybook FBI crouch. As soon as he was through the door, he simply ran as fast as he could down the tunnel, firing wildly into the darkness and shouting, "You bastard! I'm gonna rip your frigging lungs out!" at the top of his voice. Which is why he didn't notice the pillar. Not at least until it connected with his chin. 30 seconds later, Lucky George emerged from behind the pillar, prodded Lundqvist's head with his foot to make sure he was indeed fast asleep, bent down, picked up the pistol and slipped it into his pocket. A more punctilious man would have written out a receipt, but George was in a hurry. A length of parcel string and a few Boy Scout knots later, he stood up, looked both ways along the tunnel, switched on Lundqvist's torch, which the silly man had forgotten all about in his excitement, and strolled on up the tunnel whistling. 400 yards or so later, he came to a T-junction. There were helpful signs painted on the wall, thus: Hell to the right, Damnation to the left, Administration also to the left. Synonyms, George thought, but never mind. He turned left. 300 yards brought him to a lift. "Why walk," he said to himself, "when you can ride? The trick is not to go down." The doors slid open, revealing the usual selection of buttons labelled Penthouse, Central Admin, Accounts, Cafeteria, Boiler Room, Mezzanine, Ground, Hellfire, Damnation, File store. The red light was on opposite ground. As for the rest, cafeteria sounded nice. Mezzanine was anybody's guess. And file store sent a shiver oscillating through his central nervous system. He was about to press cafeteria when something inside him coughed discreetly and whispered, "Try the boiler room." George rationalised. Well, why not? The words conjured up a picture of a big, noisy, dark jungle of pipes and machines, the sort of place you could hide in for ages with no chance of anybody finding you. A good place to pause, regroup and work out what to do next. Narrator's note: you can tell Tom Holt used to work for the civil service because I can remember vividly when I worked for the Inland Revenue. This is way back in the Schedule D days before self-assessment. Trust me, it was a very long time ago. They used to have like these file rooms, and they like had the paper manila folders with people's main like kind of the annual returns in them. And the thing is about these filing rooms is that they had the old brown carpets from the 70s. The building that I used to work in must have been from like the turn of the century. Like this is the main one that I worked in. I worked in 3, to be honest. But the dust in these places and the paper mites, cringe. So yes, they were like the 7th level of hell, let alone when people didn't file the paperwork properly within the folders or put the folder back where it was supposed to be, because they used to do it by Schedule D reference, which was like a 5-digit, 6-digit number with a letter, and then with self-assessment where it's 10 digits. And oh my god, I'm such a nerd. Hooey! Let's get back to the story. So George wasn't convinced. What the devil do I want to go to the boiler room for? Sounds absolutely awful. He reached out to prod cafeteria, but his finger froze a few thousandths of an inch away from contact. Try the boiler room. The philosopher Socrates, so tradition has it, played horse to an inner voice, accustomed to telling him what to do in a moment of indecision. History tells us that Socrates was found guilty on trumped-up charges and executed by poison. But maybe we don't have all the facts. Maybe, a nanosecond before drinking the hemlock, Socrates asked his inner voice, "What the fuck have you gone and got me into, peanut brain?" And the inner voice explained it all in words of one syllable, allowing the great philosopher to die with a huge cocky grin frozen all over his face. Maybe there's a coffee machine in the boiler room. He lowered his finger and pressed the appropriate button, closing the lift door. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the jammy bastards, for they shall see God without an appointment. It was dark in the boiler room, as he'd predicted. It was also very quiet and very cold. All the surfaces were thick with dust. Now it is not. See, told you. All in all, Lucky George decided he'd been in more convivial graves, which was, incidentally, true. There were pipes, just as in his mental picture, and machines. Enormous machines, painted matte black enamel with heavy solid brass fittings, very old-fashioned, high-quality looking. No plastic anywhere. Steel, brass, and the occasional glass cover, white enamel dial, engraved brass control panel. None of the machines appeared to be switched on. The place had the look of a major vintage traction engine rally 5 minutes after the beer tent has opened. George had been wandering about for perhaps 10 minutes or so. Not that time seemed a particularly useful concept in a place like this, like an umbrella at the bottom of the sea, when he thought he heard a tiny, distant, screaming noise, like a very small, fast lathe. He walked towards it. It was a long walk. The place was, he realised, absolutely huge and full of these enormous, silent pieces of hardware, each one, he noticed, curiously, apparently different. He hadn't had the faintest idea what any of them were. But if only he could get in here with a small crane and a fleet of big lorries, there was an absolute fortune in scrap value alone. If wishes were pantechnicons, beggars would invest heavily in offshore roll-up unit trusts. George dismissed the thought from his mind because the light and the noise were getting closer. Still a hell of a long way away, though. George's feet were beginning to hurt. Scream. Pause. Scream. Unmistakable sound of cutting metal. Someone was making something. Scree! Squee! Squee! Bugger! A minuscule voice, ever so far away. George stopped dead in his tracks and listened, but all he could hear was the sound of the lathe, like the shriek of a hysterical elf. Blessed are the born idle, for they shall stand and watch other people working. George walked on toward the noise. Had Lynx Jotopian been there, instead of lying on his back sleeping the sleep of the mildly concussed, he'd have witnessed a near-perfect exhibition of the art of getting out of being tied up without cutting your wrists on the string. Having woken up, assessed the position and sworn a lot, Lundqvist used his feet to back himself up against the wall. No help there. The sides were as smooth as glass, so no useful rocky outcrops to saw through the rope on. String professionally tight, so no percentage in curling up the hands small in the hope of slipping them through. Never mind. The seasoned campaigner anticipates this sort of thing. On the back of Lundqvist's trouser belt was a thing like a big plastic button. In fact, this was a snap-on cover, easily flicked off with the fingernails, underneath which was a tiny sliver of scalpel blade fixed lengthways to the belt on a rivet. Nothing easier than to fray the rope up against it a few times and then to gently ease it apart. Cheating? In the trade they call it material superiority. A little later, Lundqvist stood up, marshalled his limbs into some semblance of discipline, and trudged up the corridor. He knew, without being told, that he was on a hiding to nothing. He was lost, unarmed, punch-drunk, and thoroughly demoralised. That time he retired, made way for all those up-and-coming youngsters who were the hope of the profession for the years to come. Absolutely. Just as soon as he'd found lucky bloody George and disemboweled him with his bare hands, he'd pack the whole thing in, buy a little bungalow somewhere and grow lupins. Until then, the idea of giving up was unthinkable. It would be like going on a round-the-world cruise knowing you'd left the oven on. In due course, he came to a lift. Penthouse, central admin, accounts, cafeteria, boiler room, mezzanine, ground, hellfire, damnation, file store. A likely story. You don't get presented with the Academy of Elite Forces coveted Gold Silencer Award 3 years in succession. First of all, I'd like to thank my victims, without whom, unless you can recognise a supernaturally induced hologram when you see one. If the wretched thing had had trap over the door in 3-foot-high neon letters, it couldn't have been more obvious. On the other hand, what the hell? He walked in, pressed a button at random and folded his arms. Scream! Anybody home? George waited for a moment, listening to his voice echoing around the galleries of silent ironmongery until it was soaked up in the dust-insulated vastness. If there was anybody there, they were either lying in wait, too engrossed in what they were doing to hear, or listening to something on headphones. Well, if they were lying in wait, they'd had plenty of opportunities by now. He walked on. Scream! Oh, sod! The light suddenly vanished, blocked out by the bulk of an enormous machine. Slowly, feeling his intestines practising left-hand glove hitches, George edged around the machine and suddenly saw a workbench, illuminated by a low, brilliant lamp, throwing out the special brand of extra white hard light that you would need if you're dealing with tolerance of fractions of a millimetre. Around the bench were racks of tools. George assumed they were tools. Most of them he'd never seen anything like before, even in the sort of dreams that would have had Freud under a cold shower in 3 seconds flat. But he knew they were tools. They had that worn, shiny, reliable look that says, I know what I'm doing, even if you don't. Mounted in the centre of the bench was this really weird lathe. It wasn't big, but it seemed to ooze power, as if once you'd worked out how to use it, you could make absolutely anything at all on it, and George realised it was transparent. In fact, that was where the light was coming from, not the poxy 100-watt bulb in the angle poise. Light was seeping out from it in all directions, as though through a window or the crack under a door. Light from where you really didn't want to know. Behind the bench was a man, short, round, wearing a brown overall and a cap with a few wisps of untidy grey hair curling out under its brim, like Russian vine. His face consisting of a nose tip and a mouth huddled in the shelter of an enormous pair of thick lens spectacles. In one hand he held a vernier caliper, while the other he was scratching his neck just behind the ear. "Hello, George," the man said. "You found your way here all right, eh?" George nodded. Never seen this guy before in my life, he thought. Something funny here. He glanced down at the lathe. In the jaws of the chuck he could see a tiny thing, a component, a bit out of something, minute, hard, shiny with the magnificent hard gleam of newly turned steel, that beautiful clarity of tone that makes polished silver look like fog. Whatever it was, it had been machined to perfection. It seemed to sing in the lathe.
"Bloody thing,"
said the man.
"Problem?"
The man nodded.
"Taken too much off, haven't I? Useless. Have to start again."
He opened the chuck, lifted the thing out and tossed it contemptuously onto the scrap bucket under the bench.
"Me own fault,"
he said, grinning.
"In too much of a rush, as per usual."
"Been doing it long?"
23 years,
the man replied.
"Not a big job, really."
Already he had a new blank of material in the jaws and was winding the chuck.
"Don't suppose it'll take me much longer to turn up another one."
George began, and then stopped. "What was it?" he asked. The man looked up from his work.
"Ratchet collar for the main inner bearing,"
he replied.
"Fits on the main drive shaft. Stops the auto index from getting out of sync."
"Ah,
'Cause,"
the man went on, smiling,
"if that gets out of sequence, your old locator drives up the spout, and you'll be having Wednesdays for Tuesdays and Sundays midweek."
"Ah,
yeah,"
the man nodded.
"It's a good life if you don't weaken,"
he added, and measured something. Sorry," George said. "Am I disturbing you?" Because the man shook his head.
"Glad of the company," he replied. "Gets a bit lonely up here. Fiddle-arsing about all day long. You getting on all right?"
"I suppose so. Can I hold anything, or pass you things?"
"If you like."
The man scribed a line with an invisibly thin scriber.
400 yards got to come off that,"
he said.
"Should be all right so long as we go nice and steady."
He stooped down and began rummaging in a box.
400 yards?
The man nodded.
"I know,"
he said.
"Bloody fine tolerances, bugger all margin of error."
Something clicked in George's mind. It wasn't time that was weird here. It was scale. Everything here was much, much bigger than it looked, but the immensity of the place created its own unique perspectives. He'd probably been standing here for 5 years already.
"Look at the bloody mess this place is in,"
the man said, waving vaguely.
"The time I waste looking for things. Soon as I've done this job, I've got to have a bloody good tidy up."
George licked his lips, which were suddenly dry.
"Excuse me asking," he said, "but who exactly are you?"
The man looked up.
"Me?"
he said. George nodded. With a flick of his finger, the man switched on the lathe. Thousands of feet below, George just knew the faint, scarcely perceptible noise it made was midsummer thunder.
"Well," the man said, "the job description is General Operative Dilapidations."
"I see."
"Bit of a mouthful,"
the man said. George nodded. "Usually abbreviated, I suppose."
"That's the idea."
"Right." George took a deep breath. "I've been wanting to meet you for a long time." General Operative Dilapidations, better known by the handy acronym. Lundqvist stopped dead in his tracks. He could feel the point needle-sharp against the skin of his neck, that particularly vulnerable spot between the collarbones.
"Good eye,"
said the angel. Lundqvist thought about edging backwards, but knew that the point would follow him. Angel or no angel, this guy knew his trade. At least, Lundqvist realised, I know where I am now. "I thought," he said, looking down the runway of fine blued steel that ran from his neck to the angel's hand, "you people were supposed to be equipped with flaming swords." The angel gave him a look. "Stand the Christ, sport," he said. "What do you think this is, a flaming letter opener?" "Aye, God," said Lucky George.
"Could you just pass me that file?"
God replied.
"Not that one, the little Swiss job with the red handle." "Ta."
George looked down the rack. saw something like an extra thin hair with the appropriate coloured handle, and passed it over. God pushed his glasses back up his nose, closed one eye, and swept the file, fed the light over the surface of the metal.
"Bugger,"
he said.
"Press too hard. Look, bloody great graunch marks all over the thing. I have to stone it all off and start again."
He sighed and reached for an atom-thin whetstone.
"I must be having one of those days,"
he said. George replaced the file in the rack. "Dilapidations?" he asked. The man nodded.
"That means fixing things," he said. "It's what I mostly do these days. You made it, they said to me. You damn well fix it when it plays up. Fair enough, I suppose. Means I can put in a few mods here and there whenever I see something I can improve."
He pointed at the component in the chuck.
"Like this, for instance."
George smiled weakly. "You did say what it was," he said, "but I'm afraid I've forgotten."
"Pretty simple, really,"
God replied.
"Time, right? Your basic 7-day week revolves on a central spindle. Each day is indexed into position by a lifting hand driving a ratchet, and then it's locked in place by a spring-loaded pole locating in a groove. See? Absolutely basic design."
George nodded helplessly. Somehow or other he understood. Vaguely. The man shook his head.
"Bloody awful," he said. "Makes me ashamed every time I think of it. All it needs is for the bearing in the cylinder rides onto wear a bit and the whole thing grinds to a halt."
"And has it?"
"Bound to. This is the third one I've had to make so far, and the bloody thing's scarcely running."
George stared. "You mean the world?" he said.
"The universe,"
God replied.
"Shouldn't have components like this packing up already. Should be good for another 40 billion years at least, with a bit of lube and a good clean now and again, before I've got to start replacing the bearings. Must have got it wrong somewhere, don't you think?"
George remained silent. Not for him to say, he reckoned.
"So,"
God continued, rubbing his nose with the back of his hand,
"this time I'm making the bugger out of 16-gauge chromium carbide. I'm going to case harden it again before it goes back in, making sure there's no soft spots where I've cut too deep. If that doesn't do it, then stuff it."
He increased the lathe speed slightly, and the cutter screed across the surface, throwing out tiny specks of swarf-like powdered stars.
"Leap year,"
George said.
"You got it?"
the man replied.
"That's only when it gets really bad, mind you, when the whole poxy year gets out of sequence. A little bit like that, you see. It can bugger up the whole sodding thing in no time at all."
"I suppose so."
"No suppose about it."
Scree went the lathe. Tiny flecks of ground material, so small as to float in the air, drifted down, out through the air conditioning system and onwards through the galaxy, tails burning, frightening the living daylights out of superstitious princes.
"Your time, see? That's your major motive force. If your time goes wrong, everything goes wrong. Bits get out of place, components get all crunched and burred up, things fall apart this centre cannot hold."
"Entropy," said George.
"Poncy name for it, but yeah."
God was silent for a moment, brooding.
"This ought to do the trick. Let's have to try it and see, won't we?"
He turned up the lathe speed until the component disappeared in a white blur and screed for a while. From time to time he stopped, measured, tutted, scratched his ear and started again. The surface of the thing was so smooth it seemed to evade eyesight, like wet soap in a bath.
"Well now, mate,"
George said, miking the component up for the 10th or 11th time.
"I suppose we ought to be getting you back to the old hot spot in a minute."
He closed one eye and squinted through his right spectacle lens at the micrometer dial.
"Another gnat's nibble still to go.
He sighed.
"Always takes longer than you think, this last bit."
George stayed where he was, immobilised. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. Not a nice feeling, but somehow it didn't hurt. This was because he knew the man would do the right thing.
Can't have people breaking out all over the place,
God went on.
Shocking. Got to do something about it. Just pass me that small oil can. The one on your left. No, the other one. Thanks.
So, George said, and the trumpets all sounded for him on the other side. You're having a problem with time, are you? The man laughed.
You can say that again,
he said.
Bloody old stuff. Biggest blessed nuisance in the old setup. Here, what do you make that? My eyes are getting so bad it's terrible sometimes.
George peered. He could just about make out the dial, but no calibrations whatsoever.
I make it 0.364,
said God.
Yep. I mean,
he went on,
it's horrible old thing's the easy bit. Take out the knackered part, turn up a new one, slap it in, job done. It's what to do with all the waste stuff that's the problem.
George nodded. He'd worked that out for himself, although by what logical route he had no idea.
Temporal waste, he said. Nasty. Diabolical.
God sighed.
24 hours more of it every day. Leaking like buggery and stinking the place out. Can't burn it, can't bury it, doesn't dissolve in anything. You're stuck with it.
And George interrupted. It's not as if there's an endless supply of it to start with. God groaned.
Don't remind me,
he said.
Daftest thing I ever did, making the other thing run on fossil fuel. Should have known better.
Easy mistake to make.
Daft mistake to make.
God switched off the lathe and lifted out the finished part.
It's not brilliant, he said, but it'll have to do. Pass me that duster, will you?
In other words, George went on the one hand, you've too much waste time, and on the other, not enough raw material. He paused, fully aware of the awesome nature of his position. Doesn't that suggest something to you? He said quietly. God looked at him. Like, he forced himself to continue. Recycling. God laughed.
Sure, he said, if I could, but I can't, can I?
This is it, George, old son, so go for it. Yes, you can, he heard himself say. No trouble. God looked at him again, and hell was much, much better. In hell, they only beat you up. Reflected in the lenses of God's spectacles, George could see himself, the truth, the real thing. Could have been worse, he realised. But still not a pleasant thing to happen to anybody, the sum total of your being splashed like a fly on a windscreen. No trouble, he repeated. It works like this. So, what is George and the Almighty going to cook up together to recycle the temporal waste? Is it all going to come together? Is the Almighty going to send George back down to where he belongs? Or is he going to get a little bit of a, where you go, son? Who knows? And what happened to Larry and Mike? What's going to happen with them? And also, what's going to happen to Mr. Lundqvist? Yeah, I'm really quite enjoying this. I'm going to miss it when we finish this one. I really am. So, we got a couple of little chapters coming up. We've got, I think I might do a doubler because, well, to be honest, I could do the next 3 in one go because we've got 4 pages, and 10 pages. 7 pages. So essentially, we could do the next 3 chapters in one go, but still do them as 3 separate chapters, obviously. But I could do another sort of like little run on those to just get them done this week, which is pretty awesome, isn't it? And then we'll do Painty Dragon, and I'm really excited to do that one we're getting. Yes, that's going to be fantastic. So, as ever, if you've got this far, if you could leave me a little note in the comments, let me know how you're doing. Just let me know you're okay and things are going all right and what you're going to be up to this week. And are you looking forward to autumn/fall? What you're going to be planning for your autumn season? Are you going anywhere? Are you doing anything? What interesting things have you been seeing and doing? Anything fun outside? But yeah, as ever, please just leave us a comment if you'd like to. Even if you just want to leave an emoji in the comment section, that's cool. If you want to share, subscribe, that is fantastic because it keeps the lights on. And if you just want to hit the like button, that's fine as well because it keeps the lights on and keeps the hamsters happy and keeps things ticking over all nicely. And what I might do is I might start a little vote as to, you know, if at some point you guys will want to hear me do my impression of the Muppet Babies theme. I know it's daft. I know it's daft, but it's a little party piece, and I think it's fun. But I do all the Muppet Babies voices throughout, and it's quite a fun little tune to do. But anyway, for now, I will say take it easy, take care, keep warm, keep hydrated, keep cool if it's too hot, keep warm if it's too cold, and keep comfy at all times. And I'll be back in another couple of days. So. We will bring it, we will fix it, we will stick it with scissors and glue. See you in a couple of days, Petal. Take it easy.